What if I told you Rome once celebrated a wedding so impossible that the bride had never been born a woman, a ceremony forged from grief, staged for an emperor's delusion, and sealed with a flame-colored veil? Tonight, we descend beneath the marble into the cold breath of power where a boy's face was forced to resurrect a dead empress. If you dare to confront the disturbing truth behind that veil, hit subscribe now and stay with me, because the final act Rome planned for its manufactured bride will chill you long after the torches die. The story begins in corridors of polished stone where footsteps echo like verdicts, where Nero's singer-ruler-executioner poured charm and terror into a single cup. His Rome glittered with gold leaf and smoke, and beside him stood Poppaea Sabina, a beauty that bent policy like soft metal, her name spoken as both prayer and threat, until one night rage boiled over, and the empire woke to a silence only grief can make. Poppaea had not appeared from myth, but from calculation. A woman whose radiance traveled faster than rumor, whose counsel slid into Nero's ear like a knife in velvet. She urged him to prune the tangle of loyalties strangling his rule, and so branches fell. Friends banished, rivals erased, a first wife dismissed as a dull echo of an old alliance, while Rome blinked at the transformation and wondered how many petals one could pluck before a rose became a thorn. Looming behind these chambers stood Agrippina the Younger, the mother who had steered Nero to the throne on a river of sharp decisions. Histories call her brilliant, merciless, impossible to ignore, and the palace breathed her name with both reverence and dread. But the day came when mother and son faced one another as two suns in the same sky, and only one would burn. When she was gone, a new vacancy opened in Nero's heart, where love and guilt might feed on each other. Octavia, the lawful wife, had the misfortune of being steady in a court addicted to spectacle. She was pushed aside to make room for Poppaea, and the empire watched as titles shifted like stage scenery. Then came the night when Poppaea, heavy with child, spoke too frankly to a man drunk on victory and wine, and an eruption of fury wrote an irreversible sentence. By morning, Nero possessed an empire and a memory that would not stop staring back at him. Grief turned Nero into a priest of impossible rites. He drowned Rome in ceremonies, perfumed her body with spices fit for queens beyond the sea, whispered divinity into her cold ears, and still the absence roared. The emperor, who could command legions, found he could not command time, so he ordered a search not for a wife, but for a mirror, auditioning features gestures, hair like sunlight caught in amber, yet every candidate failed to haunt him correctly. Somewhere, in that laboring machinery of servants and couriers and watchful eyes, a young slave crossed a threshold and became a problem for which Rome had no language. His name was Sporus, his face fine-boned, luminous, the kind of beauty that in a gentler world would have purchased him luck. Fate, indifferent and efficient, placed him under Nero's gaze, and in that instant the emperor believed the dead had found a mouth through which to breathe again. Within hours, the palace learned to speak around the boy as if he were a fragile artifact or a trap. Whispers coiled through the colonnades that the emperor had discovered a likeness so precise it chilled the back of the throat. Physicians were summoned not for healing, but for transformation. An order moved like a shadow along the wall. If destiny would not return Poppaea intact, Rome would sculpt a substitute out of living fear. The act that followed belonged not to medicine, but to power, which is to say it required no explanation and permitted no refusal. Sporus was altered in a way meant to erase futures, the procedure brutal in method and colder in meaning. And when he survived, because fantasies prefer their actors alive, he did so into a chamber where identity would be sanded down, repainted, and held up to a portrait until the similarity hurt to look at. Tailors learned the measurements of a memory. Hairdressers studied statues to copy a widow's halo. Tutors taught the boy how to glide rather than walk to smile with Poppaea's absence. rather than his own joy. Then Rome attended a wedding no oracle had foreseen Nero in the garments of a groom, Sporus veiled like a flame, the elite holding their breath as vows were spoken, and a kiss sealed the empire's most expensive illusion. Outside, the city exhaled and pretended this was normal. In the days after the wedding, the palace refitted itself around the illusion, and Sporus was given an empress's apartments, an empress's attendants, an empress's titles whispered by stewards who kept their eyes lowered, jewels nested like frost along his throat, and wrists a chariot with curtains to hide and display him at once, and yet every corridor felt narrow, every door too heavy, because each glittering gift arrived with a chain you could not see. Nero paraded his triumph through theaters and temples, introducing Sporus as my wife, with a tenderness that could turn without warning, kissing him in public while senators swallowed their shock, and courtiers perfected the art of not blinking. And Rome learned a new etiquette: you laughed softly at the emperor's jokes, you admired the bride's veil, and you never ever asked whose face lay beneath it. Nights were worse than ceremonies because they were honest. The emperor unspooled memories of Poppaea as if they were tapestries to wrap around Sporus. How she tilted her head to listen, how she held a cup, how her laugh broke like a wave, and Sporus learned to echo without becoming to move like a shadow, where the light insisted on a different shape until the mirror refused to remember his original name. Beyond the palace walls, lampooners sharpened their verses. Gossip curled like smoke in bathhouses, and a city practiced selective blindness, for empires survive on quiet as much as on legions. Some muttered that the artist emperor had turned life into theater. Others warned that theater had become law, and Sporus discovered that the most dangerous audience is the one that pretends it is not watching. Meanwhile, the map trembled. Governors in Gaul and Hispania tested the seams of loyalty. Legions murmured in winter camps. Tax collectors found doors unbarred and eyes unwelcoming. And on Nero's desk arrived letters whose seals cracked like thunder rebuke from the Senate defection from men who had once hung garlands at his door, each parchment a small subtraction from the idea that an emperor could want and therefore have. The end, when it came, broke unevenly. Friends vanished. The Praetorian oath frayed to threads, the Senate named him enemy, and Nero fled through gardens with only a handful of attendants, and a fear that at last spoke louder than the songs he loved. History says his final line mourned the artist dying within him, but in the silence that followed, another truth arrived. Rome had escaped a tyrant, while Sporus had lost the only protection his nightmare afforded. Power hates a vacuum, and Otho stepped into it with the confidence of a man who mistook movement for destiny, gathering the remnants of Nero's glamour to warm his own chill. Sporus among them, because revenge wears many costumes, and one of them is claiming the substitute when you cannot reclaim the dead. To the new emperor, Sporus was both trophy and talisman, a way to balance old humiliations on a fresh throne. Otho's star arced brilliantly and briefly, and when it fell, he took his life with soldierly economy, leaving the palace to scavengers of legitimacy. In the shuffle, a Praetorian power broker, part policeman, part kingmaker, reached for Sporus as if a person could be an endorsement. And for the second time, the boy learned how quickly a nameplate on a door can be unscrewed while you are still sleeping behind it. Then Vitellius lumbered in with appetites that reached beyond the table, promising Rome a feast of spectacles to drown out uncertainty. And somewhere between decrees and drunken boasts, an idea surfaced as foul as it was simple: drag the imperial bride into the arena and force him to perform a violation disguised as myth turn private torment into public entertainment, and let thunderous applause finish the work that scalpels had begun. On the eve of that planned humiliation, Sporus sat beneath a window latticed with moonlight. The flame-colored veil folded on his lap, like a question that had waited too long for an answer, and he understood that every door out of the labyrinth had a price painted above it. Tomorrow, the crowd would roar for a scene he could not survive intact. So tonight, he began to weigh the only choice still his to make. He considered every exit the palace allowed flight disguise, pleading with the fickle god, but each path curved back to the arena, so he chose the only door no emperor could bar, sending word to a single loyal servant to keep the lamps low and the corridor clear, so for once he could cross a threshold without being watched. There are deaths that are surrender and deaths that are refusal, and Sporus made his into the latter, not to dramatize pain for an audience, but to cancel the tickets to deny the crowd its chorus to keep one secret for himself, in a life that had been cross-examined by power until it confessed whatever was convenient. At dawn, the handlers found an absence where a spectacle should have been. The veil lay folded like a closed book. The chamber smelled of oil and cold air, and a runner sprinted to Vitellius, who answered with a curse, and for a heartbeat a glance at the middle distance, as if the arena had suddenly reminded him of something human. Rome received the news the way empires receive any message that does not change taxation or the troop movement. A shiver of gossip in bathhouses, a few sharp verses scratched on wall plaster, a rumor that the manufactured bride had chosen his own ending, and then the city returned to problems with bread borders and men who believed their appetites were policy. When Vespasian's banners finally steadied the skyline, the year of 4 emperors hardened into history, and Sporus thinned into a footnote traveling between authors' margins, Suetonius with his taste for scandal, Dio with his imperial autopsies of motive, each writer touching the story and leaving fingerprints that scholars still compare under the light. The record cannot agree on every step he took after Nero, but the outline is stubborn. A boy bent into a bride, paraded like an answer to grief, then repurposed as revenge, almost converted into theater, and finally slipping out of the script. What remains constant is the machinery around him, smooth-oiled, indifferent to screams or silence. In the palaces, where he once learned to walk with borrowed grace, the floors did not remember him. In the forums where the crowd had measured emperors with cheers and yawns, nobody built a statue to the person who refused their entertainment. Memory, like law, bent toward the powerful, and Sporus had only the power of saying no at the end. If Nero had called this love, the city had called it novelty. And both were wrong, for love does not kidnap likeness and crown it, and novelty does not amputate a future to fit an old costume. What happened to Sporus was administration, the routine operation of a court that used people as solvents to erase stains it refused to name. Sometimes I imagine a clerk inventorying the imperial stores, and pausing over a box labeled veils, bridal flame colored, wondering why one smells faintly of summer air in a closed room, and whether fabric can keep secrets better than people, and whether history is just a warehouse where the tags outlive what they describe. We will go back now, not to dwell on cruelty, but to understand the welds and rivets of the machine that made it possible, the politics that praised performance, the courtiers who learned to survive by applauding the laws that permitted a face to be treated as evidence and a body as a mold. And before we're done, we'll ask what it costs a society to call that normal. In the old training chamber where he first practiced another person's posture, Sporus learned how repetition wears grooves into the mind, the way a dancer's body remembers steps long after music stops. He could feel the ghost choreography even in silence, tilt the chin, soften the gaze, measure each breath as if every gesture were a key that unlocked a door in someone else's memory and slammed shut the door to his own. Resemblance, he realized, is not a mirror, but a mold, and molds demand the surrender of edges. When Nero said you, he meant her, and the pronoun became a net that dragged him farther from shore. So Sporus began to stash tiny contraband moments, the cadence of his native dialect whispered into a cushion, the way his fingertips tapped a rhythm. No tutor had taught proofs that underneath the empire's varnish a pulse still kept its own time. A Praetorian who once stood at the chapel door would later tell a drinking companion that the wedding smelled of myrrh and damp linen, that the bride's veil jittered like a captured flame in a draught from the oculus, and that when the vows were spoken, a sparrow trapped in the rafters chirped once and fell silent, as if the gods themselves had coughed, looked at their hands and decided not to get involved. In theaters, the emperor presented his revived love like a triumph over death, and the audience practiced a new facial expression halfway between awe and survival. Senators learned to applaud with their fingertips so the sound would not carry into their conscience. Matrons angled their eyes away, as if modesty could excuse complicity. And on the marble steps afterward, the city's jokes grew sharper, precisely because the laughter stayed trapped behind teeth. When the regime collapsed and the rumor of suicide spilled across the city like wine, a palace matron found Sporus in a corridor staring at an extinguished lamp and murmured the only medicine she knew: keep breathing, keep quiet, keep moving. And he obeyed because breath and silence and motion had been the tools of his trade long before they became the tools of his survival. Otho's household felt like a theater. After the audience has left warm seats, abandoned programs, stage lights still hot, he installed Sporus not with tenderness but with intention, a curator mounting the most controversial exhibit in Rome. And at feasts he would lean into the murmur that this was justice done backward, that a man who had lost a wife to a tyrant might reclaim her shadow and call that balance, never mind the cost to the shadow. Between Otho's rise and his abrupt exit, the palace filled with men who made and unmade emperors by lunchtime. One of them, Nymphidius Sabinus, reached for Sporus, the way a banker reaches for collateral, plying the guard with promises, testing whether a signature could be forged across a human life, and in the confusion Sporus learned the difference between being guarded and being stored. Vitellius announced himself with banquets and brass, and when morsels of power were not enough, he craved entire spectacles, thundering that Rome deserved laughter so loud it erased last year. Out of this hunger came the plan for Sporus in the arena, not as a person but as a punctuation mark, a living exclamation to finish a sentence about the empire's right to anything it could imagine. That night, turning the folded veil in his hands, Sporus understood that refusal is a language many never learn, because the grammar is costly, that to decline a stage can be braver than to storm it, and that sometimes the only sovereignty available to a captive is the moment when he decides the show will not go on and means it. Afterward, the chronicles would compress him into a line and pass on, but lines can cut stone if you read them long enough. And in the faint groove he left, we can see how law becomes stagecraft when unchecked, how courts become audiences when comforted, and how a single whispered no in a locked room can sound, if you listen centuries later, like a trumpet calling a city back to its senses. In the months that followed, Rome arranged itself around the new normal, with the same bureaucratic calm it used for aqueducts and taxes, and Sporus's absence was processed like a logistical glitch. Reports, amended servants reassigned a procurement note, canceling floral orders for a spectacle that would never happen, proof that the machinery of empire is most terrifying when it shrugs. Historians later picked at the seams and left us a quilt of contradictions. Some call him a boy, others a youth. Some put him with Otho, some with the Praetorian kingmaker before Vitellius. Yet, through the noise, one contour never blurs. A human being was refashioned to soothe a sovereign's guilt, and every hand that steadied the veil helped lift the knife without holding it. Even his name vibrates like irony across the centuries. Sporus, from the Greek for seed, a cruel metaphor for a life conscripted into sterility, a word that should have promised growth repurposed by power into a brand. And there in that etymology you can hear the palace language at work, turning meanings inside out until resistance sounds impolite. Think of the tutors who corrected his vowels, the maidservants who pinned his hair, the chamberlain who rehearsed the sequence of doors before a public appearance. None of them swung a sword, and yet the sum of their small obediences built a scaffold sturdy enough to hold an emperor's dream, which is how atrocities prefer to travel hidden inside duty. There are nights when the city seemed to remember him. Despite itself, a cool wind threading the Colosseum tunnels, a bit of dyed silk caught in a crack of travertine. A joke that dies on a tongue mid-syllable. Memory is a climate, not a courtroom, and sometimes it condemns without verdict by refusing to let a story sit still. If you stand in a basilica where senators once perfected the art of cautious applause, you can almost hear the arithmetic of silence. How many claps equal safety? How many sidelong glances equal consent? And you realize that the math still works wherever audiences mistake shock for courage and spectacle for strength. Sporus's life also sketches a map of grief turned predatory. Nero did not want companionship, he wanted absolution in drag. He did not resurrect love, he embalmed guilt, and the city, afraid to call the ritual by its true name, wrapped it in incense and said, "Amen," proving that rituals can sanctify anything if the room is afraid enough. After the year of 4 emperors, hardened into the Flavian peace chroniclers, shelved the episode like a scandalous scroll, useful as warning, delicious as gossip. Yet between their lines a quieter syllabus remains. Teach your princes that beauty is not a permit, that resemblance is not consent, that grief does not deputize cruelty to rebuild what it shattered. Imagine then a counterfactual so small it barely counts as fantasy. A guard who says no and keeps his job, a steward who misplaces a key and means it, a senator who laughs at the wrong time and thus resets the room. Tiny acts of friction do not stop an empire, but they roughen the rails, and sometimes that is enough to slow a nightmare down. We return at last to the folded veil, the quiet room, the choice that closed a door power could not reopen. Sporus leaves the stage not as a symbol, but as a person reclaiming 1 minute of ownership over his own narrative, and if there is any justice available to history. It is this: when we say his name, we do not mean a costume, a joke, or a prop, but the human weight that resisted them. Power does not announce itself with a trumpet so much as with a checklist. Authenticate the ceremony, register, the titles, adjust, the payroll, update, the seating chart. And in watching those lists get ticked, we see the real sorcery, not lightning from the gods, but ink from clerks. The quiet miracle by which a human being is transformed into a position, and then the position devours the human being who fills it. Consider how the city learned to rename the unbearable into the ordinary, how shock decays into routine if given enough repetitions, how the first gasp at the emperor's bride softened into a shrug, and then into etiquette, until one day the same mouths that whispered outrage whispered instructions for where the bride should stand for better light. The most chilling idea in this story is that resemblance became evidence, and evidence became sentence. In a culture that prized mythic echoes, a face could be treated like a forged document, and the notary was grief itself, stamping approval on a plan that solved a tyrant's loneliness by outsourcing it to someone else's body. Look at the props that carried the plot: the flame-colored veil, a ring that fit as if memory had measured the finger, a mirror too honest for the room, a door that swung only one way, and a name, Sporus, that should have promised origins but was made to advertise endings. Every atrocity contains an architecture, and architecture can be dismantled. If the tutor had paused one lesson, if the chamberlain had scheduled a necessary delay, if a senator had laughed where silence was required, if a guard had winked at the wrong time, the machine might have coughed and stalled long enough for breath to matter. Hear the small voices that history seldom invoices: the hairdresser who learned to copy a dead woman's parting without asking why, the scribe who copied rehearsal notes and suddenly realized they were vows, the doorkeeper who discovered that holding a door is sometimes indistinguishable from holding a person inside. Rome itself behaves like a character in this tale, its wind creeping through colonnades like a nosy servant. its baths boiling news into foam, its stones swallowing footsteps from men who believed granite could forget, and yet the city keeps a kind of atmospheric memory, a pressure change whenever and wherever a life was pressed into a mold. To tell Sporus's story without turning him into a spectacle again is to refuse the easy camera angles. We do not ogle the wound, we trace the policy. We do not amplify the cruelty, we diagram the complicity. We do not call his endurance romantic. We call it what it was: survival in a room designed to erase the survivor. If there is a refrain here, it is this: not madness, but administration. Not possession by spirits, but possession by paperwork. Not a miracle of love, but a logistics of grief dressed for a parade. When we strip off the incense, we discover filing, scheduling, compliance. The dull tools that cut the deepest, because nobody notices them. Keep your eyes on the veil folded in the quiet room, because in our final chapters, we will follow its thread through other courts and other centuries, ask how a civilization teaches itself to applaud what should horrify it, and test whether memory can be trained to say no and mean it before the next ceremony begins. The sources do not sing in unison. Suetonius prefers scandal. Tacitus prefers statecraft. Dio prefers moral anatomy. But if you listen past the clamor, you hear the same steady drum. A sovereign sought absolution, not by confession but by sculpture, chiseling a living body into the outline of a ghost. And in that rhythm, you can count the cost not only to Sporus, but to everyone who learned that silence is a currency accepted at every imperial counter. Look closely at the ritual, because its grammar outlives its actors. Find the likeness, rename the person. Rehearse the illusion. Repeat it in public until outrage curdles into etiquette, and then defend the etiquette as heritage. This is how spectacles become traditions, how violations become customs, and how a city wakes one morning unable to tell the difference between mourning and mummery. To tell this without reenacting the harm means resisting the camera's lazy appetite. We keep the lens on the paperwork that enabled the wound, the corridors that carried the orders, the courtiers who translated grief into logistics, and we refuse to make the pain itself the point, because Sporus was not created to be a cautionary tale for our entertainment, but a human being whose refusal at the end deserves the last word. Some will try to turn his story into a parable about gender, others into an anecdote about imperial eccentricity. It is neither and both, but above all, it is about consent and its annihilation, about a world where identity could be requisitioned like incense or horses, and about the miracle quiet defiant that a person can reclaim a sliver of themselves by choosing not to be watched anymore. Imagine the hinge moments we will never find in any chronicle: the hand that almost set down the quill, instead of signing the guard whose lips almost formed the syllable "no," the tutor who almost closed the book and asked the only forbidden question, "What is your name truly?" and recognize how history turns on almost that rarely make it to parchment but always haunt the air around the events we do record. If you zoom out, Rome is only one stanza in a longer poem about power staging. Miracles upon the backs of the vulnerable courts in other centuries would paint different veils, write different vows, and call their arenas by gentler names. Yet the dramaturgy repeats. An audience is gathered, a role is assigned. A body is offered up to heal a wound that violence itself opened. That is why Sporus's final act matters beyond the biography. By declining the climax scripted for him, he ruined the ending of the Empire's favorite genre redemption through spectacle. And in the ruined ending, we glimpse the truth that some performances only end when someone refuses to be the prop, a truth empires fear, because it teaches audiences to measure their applause against their conscience. Carry this forward like a warning bell. Whenever policy borrows the vocabulary of theater, costumes, stages, roles, ask who writes the script and who pays the ticket price. Whenever grief reaches for a substitute instead of accountability, ask which clerk will be ordered to make the substitution official. Whenever a face is treated like evidence, ask where the verdict was written before the trial began, and then return just once more to the quiet room where the veil lay folded, and a life decided not to be administered anymore. Say his name without irony. Sporus, not seed repurposed into sterility, but person reclaimed from a sentence, and let the echo remind you that dignity is not a monument erected by the powerful but a boundary kept by the powerless at terrible cost. If this story held, you stay with this channel where we exhume the mechanics beneath history's darkest legends and tell them with empathy rather than appetite. Like, share, and comment with the questions you want answered. Subscribe to walk further with us, beyond the torches, into the rooms where decisions are made, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next investigation because the curtain hasn't fallen on Power's Theater. And the only way to stop clapping at the wrong times is to learn how the show is built.